this afternoon, so thank you for visiting us here. But welcome to the American Revolution Museum of Yorktown, everybody. My name's Jamie, and I'm going to make some noise for you the next few minutes. Is that all right?
Yeah.
All right, good. Now, of course, we are going to fire one of these weapons for you. We're going to give York County something to think about here in the next few minutes. But before I do, we're going to explain a few things about the Continental Army's Artillery Division, and specifically why we place so much of an emphasis on the Artillery Division of the Army here of all places. Right? There's a very good reason for that. If you've been over the historic area of York County, you may have noticed some original and reproduction artillery pieces over there as well. We even have a confectionery shop over in Yorktown that sells little chocolate cannons. We love the artillery here in Yorktown, Virginia. There's a very good reason for that, right? But I'm also going to explain exactly what these weapons are directly behind me, what they're for, what they're called, how the Army utilized them during the siege of Yorktown, and then, of course, I'm going to go ahead, step back, we will load this weapon up, and we will fire for you. Does that sound like a plan?
Yes.
All right, very good. So, folks, I always like to talk about what happened here in Yorktown, Virginia first. We know that the engagement that took place here in 1781 goes down in U.S. history as being the last major military engagement of the entire American Revolution. Following the American victory here at Yorktown 1781, well, the war starts to come to a close. Now, it was not the end of the fighting. This was just the last major battle, last major siege of this particular engagement. Right? You may have heard me say it earlier. I called the engagement here a siege. The siege of Yorktown, folks, not the battle of Yorktown. That is one of the very few history details we get picky with here at this museum. Right? So because there is a key difference between a battle and a siege. Right? First of all, a battle typically is going to take place on open terrain. Right? Where the enemy infantry and cavalry, they can actually engage, maneuver around each other on that open plain. Whereas a siege is going to take place from behind the earthen fortifications that you see bordering our amphitheater this afternoon, as well as one by our parking lot just right across the way. Right? During a siege, it's going to be a little bit difficult for the infantry and the cavalry to engage each other because, well, that's what those earthen fortifications are designed to slow down. Right? So it's going to slow down the progress of your infantry. The cavalry can't really engage, so instead, you're going to have to use these big things right behind me. Right, so we know that the way this took place was that in 1781, the British commander in the South at that time, Lord Cornwallis, had just gotten finished fighting a very long and hard campaign against the American army in the South, and he ends up here in Virginia in an attempt to get away from the American army that had been attacking him. Right, now he had been attacking them too, but he ends up here in Virginia, and when he finally ends up here after that long southern campaign, he ends up getting a letter from his commanding officer in the British Army saying that he needs to fortify some area along the Chesapeake Bay, right, that is connected to that York River just right out there, because the British Navy finally realized that they haven't taken that area yet. And they did realize that they could get the British Navy into one of these major waterways by the Chesapeake Bay, and they could eventually assist the British Army in taking and holding the rest of these southern states. Right, so that was the whole idea, right? Now when he ends up here, he ends up trying first James River. Didn't really work out all that well. He ends up here in the York River because today we know that is a very wide, deep water channel that can actually hold ships of that particular size. And to this day, folks, if you spend some time in the historic triangle, you will see the modern U.S. Navy still housing ships right over there in the York River. Right, so still it's used for the same reason the British Navy was going to use it in 1781. Right, very good access to the Chesapeake right over there. But when Washington learned of this plan, and he did learn of this plan because unfortunately for Lord Cornwallis, Washington had very good spies here in Yorktown 1781. That plan ends up on Washington's desk, and he decides he's going to send an entire division of his army down to Williamsburg, Virginia, rendezvous with the Marquis de Lafayette, his portion of the American army, and they start the long trek all the way over there to Yorktown, Virginia, with not just one or two or three, but roughly 135 pieces of artillery that are specifically designed to batter those fortifications down and to force Cornwallis to surrender. Right, so that's why we like the artillery here, folks. The artillery division is really what made this siege possible. Right? But we do have a few examples of those artillery pieces right behind me. First one I always like to point out is the one sitting right there on that small red box. I know that weapon is small by comparison, but don't be fooled by it, folks. If loaded and primed correctly, that weapon is every bit as loud as the one standing next to it right there. Right? So that is known as a 4.5-inch coal-horn mortar. Now the weapon we're going to fire for you this afternoon is sitting on that blue carriage, and its clone is sitting right there on that black carriage. If I were to ask everybody here to describe these two long-barreled pieces, what would you call those things, folks? I'm not trying to trick you. Yeah, certainly you could call that a cannon, but the reason I asked that question is in the 18th century, artillerists were referring to these long-barreled weapons as not just cannons, but battalion guns or siege guns. But either way, the operative term there is it is a gun. Right? You can call it a gun, you can call it a cannon, you can call it a battalion gun, siege gun, but either way, that's a cannon for you in the 18th century. Right? Now, during the siege of Yorktown, you're going to need a weapon that is very similar to that, as well as mortars. Right? Now, in the case of that mortar, it is going to fire something that is rather useful for a siege. It is firing this right here, folks. It is called a shell. It's a hollowed out iron sphere filled with gunpowder. And now I said that mortar is a 4.5-inch mortar. So can anybody tell me what the diameter of this shell is? 4.5 inches. There you go, right? During the siege of Yorktown, there were 10-inch and 13-inch mortars. That's just a 4.5-inch, by the way, to put that into perspective. Right? But a shell is just a hollowed out iron sphere filled with gunpowder. It's going to be filled with more gunpowder in there, and it's going to be corked with a fuse. Now, the fuse is also hollow, running all the way down the center. You may notice that there are lines, marks running all the way down that fuse. That's going to tell somebody known as a bombardier the exact amount of time, or hopefully the exact amount of time, it's going to take for that fuse composition to burn all the way down, ignite the powder on the inside of that shell, and then, of course, what happens to the shell? It will burst. It will explode, right? So the explosions that you would have seen on an 18th century battlefield, as well as during siege warfare, they're coming from weapons like that 4.5-inch mortar, right? If you're talking about this battalion gun behind any one of our cannons, it is firing this right here. In the case of our cannons, they are 6-pound battalion guns, or 6-pounders. That is in reference to this shot right here. Now, just like with that shell. That mortar is called a 4.5-inch mortar because it fires a 4.5-inch shell. If I call that cannon a 6-pounder, that means this cannonball must weigh what? 6 pounds, clearly, because I'm holding it over my head. Right, so, but during the siege of Yorktown, you would have seen cannons that were firing a bit bigger of a projectile. Right? Instead of that 6-pounder, you would have seen 18-pound and 24-pound. That's what I have here. Now, if you're in the naval services, you would have seen a 32-pound cannon, as well as a 42-pound cannon, right? When you get in the Navy, they get a little bit bigger. But during the siege of Yorktown, this was the biggest iron projectile you would have seen on that battlefield. Right? But unlike the shell, this cannonball is going to have a slightly different effect. Right? The reason I call these long-barreled pieces guns, not just cannons, is because they are designed to fire a solid projectile in a relatively straight path. Like I said, that shell from the mortar, that's going to cook off. That's going to explode. The shell is going to go everywhere. The explosive force of a 6-pounder, I'll demonstrate. That's it. I know it's not as dramatic as a bomb, right? So right away, that does raise a very valid question. If this 6-pounder is not going to explode, and if that 24-pounder is not going to explode, how in the world could it be useful? Of course, that's sometimes what we see in films, right? That cannonball is going to bounce its way across that field. It's going to land into something, and of course, you see an explosion after, right? So cannons aren't really designed to do that in this time period. Instead, 24-pounders like this were going to be aimed directly at the fortifications at Yorktown in an attempt to cause a dent in those fortifications. They're going to break them apart bit by bit just by the force of the cannonball alone, right? So in the case of our 6-pounder, these type of projectiles typically were not used during siege warfare. They're going to be used during a battle, some sort of open field engagement. It's also why I call that weapon back there a battalion gun. A battalion is just another way of saying a unit or a regiment of infantry. That is a battalion gun, meaning it's going to go alongside those infantry soldiers. It's going to fight alongside them, march alongside them, and it's typically firing at the same target that those infantry soldiers are. So unlike fortifications like here in Yorktown, this projectile is firing at enemy soldiers. Now, how big is it? Now, it seems a little bit more impressive, doesn't it, right? So, yeah, certainly it can be aimed either directly or indirectly at those enemy soldiers. And even though it is not going to explode or break apart, it is still going to be pretty devastating for those enemy soldiers. Because if you've seen one of our musket demonstrations this afternoon, you have heard that in the infantry, many infantry in this time period, you're going to be organized by a line of battle, a line of battle, or a linear formation. Right, so this is the idea of taking those soldiers and lining them up, shoulder to shoulder, elbow to elbow. Now, considering the musket in that soldier's hand is a very slow to load, short range weapon, it made that weapon very, very effective. But the unfortunate thing for those soldiers is it also made them a pretty big target. Right, so that cannonball is going to be loaded up. This round is going to go passing through, say, the first and the second rank of those soldiers. And, well, sir, you happen to be in front of me. I'm sorry about that. It's going to go on. I'm not throwing anything at anybody. But it's going to go all the way through that front rank. It's going to go all the way through that second rank. And even though it's not exploding, out of everybody here this afternoon, this round shot's probably taking 2 or 3 soldiers. Now, folks, to put that into perspective, one crew for a battalion gun like that consisted of 15 crew members, 5 of them known as your gunners, 10 of them known as your matrosses, and if you're going a long distance, you're going to have to hook this up to anywhere from 1 to 2 horses. It also took about 1 pound to 1.5 pounds of gunpowder just to fire this at the correct range. All that gunpowder, all that money, all that manpower, all to take out 2 or 3 soldiers. Does that seem effective?
No.
It doesn't when I put it to you like that, but let's talk to you folks over here just for a second. Somebody already knows where I'm going. Right? You didn't get hit by this round shot, folks. Matter of fact, nowhere close to getting hit by it. But you saw what happened to the middle of your section right here. How's your day going so far? Better than theirs. That's the important part. You look at the upside. I like that. Right? So what's going to happen here is you're going to see that happen. Whether you like it or not, you're going to have to stop what you're doing and do what about the gap in your line? You're going to have to fill up that line, folks. These linear formations didn't account for just the weapon in that soldier's hand. It was also the way they were able to communicate with each other, talk with each other, right? If you want to do that, you're going to have to fill in that line and keep on coming forward. Right? Now, as that starts to happen, you folks just saw a puff of smoke go off in the distance. You're not entirely sure what that puff of smoke was, but again, you saw what just happened right here. What's going through your head right about now? Hopefully not this. Right, so that's what you're thinking right about now, right? So realistically, this isn't taking out every single soldier. And of course, it's not designed to do that. What it is designed to do, though, is annoy the enemy at a great distance. Folks, that is a direct quote from this time period. There was a British artillerist that was asked after this American War for Independence what these great big guns were used for, and he said, to annoy the enemy at a great distance. Yeah, so that is what it's meant to do. After a while, you're going to feel so annoyed and so terrified because of this cannonball. Eventually, what is everybody here going to do? Eventually, you're going to run. Now, folks, that's great for us. If you're running away, what are you not doing? You're not shooting at me. Yes, absolutely. Right, more importantly than that, you're no longer standing on that battlefield. After it's all said and done, folks, after the politics are set aside, what does General Washington really want the British to do here? To go home and to leave. What better way to make somebody leave than to continue firing at them with something like that, right? And to make this matter worse for all of you as the infantry, there's not really much you can do except fill in those gaps and continue to fight or run. Those are your options you're going to have. Because the effective range of the musket inside that infantry soldier's hand, it's about how far, folks? How far does that musket shoot? Who's seen that demonstration? Yes, sir. About 100 yards, you are correct. The effective range of that cannon back there, folks, is 1,000 yards. So at nearly a mile away off of that battlefield, that cannon can reach out and hit enemy soldiers all day long. Those enemy soldiers probably don't even know where that shot is coming from yet, let alone what they're supposed to be. So certainly it's going to assist their infantry on that battlefield. It will make that enemy run, right? But of course, there are going to be some instances where the enemy doesn't run. There's going to be some times where the enemy does fill in those gaps. They continue forward up this battlefield, and they start to claim that territory. In that case, the artillerist may realize that round shot is not doing its job, right? It was meant to annoy you at a great distance. Now you're at a close distance, and you're screaming at me. I don't like that, right? So the Army's artillery was prepared for that as well. At close distances, they may have to switch things up a little bit from round shot to something called case or canister shot. Now you can hear inside this tin can is a lot more than just one projectile. There would be dozens of these all the way stacked up to the very top, and it could be loaded up inside that brass cannon over there, transforming it into a great big what? Shotgun. It's going to have the same devastating effect as a shotgun as well at close ranges, right? If they didn't have an option, they could go ahead and load canister and they could force the enemy away. So we know that in the case of mortars firing those bombs, it's actually firing it up and over those fortifications. You may notice it's cannon at a 45-degree angle. you can fire that bomb up and over those walls and destroy things on the other side of those fortifications. In the case of that cannon back there, you could use it to annoy the enemy, to disgruntle the enemy a little bit, or you could possibly use artillery like that to kill the enemy, right? But no matter what the job is, these artillerists were going to be trained for it, and this did not happen overnight, right? So we're about to demonstrate for you now, folks, the loading and firing process for just one of these weapons, right? So we're going to go ahead and get set up for this, guys. Go ahead. All right, so now, folks, as my crew gets set, in case nobody has already told you, artillery is loud. Artillery is very, very loud, right? So these troops, we're not doing this, but we certainly are. We're going to put in some hearing protection this afternoon. We like to be able to hear at the end of the day. Did y'all bring yours? That is right. Very good. So, folks, the command you want to listen for is make ready. When I shout out the command to make ready, that is going to be your signal to cover your ears as best as you possibly can. Right? Which is also going to see something known as a combat load. Right? This is a full manual exercise for these artillerists to learn, but when that manual exercise was finished, it should all be done in about 30 seconds flat. Right, so as opposed to going step by step, we're going to act under the assumption the enemy is right in that ravine down there, and we need to load as quickly as we possibly can. Understand, this is just a 6-pounder you're about to hear, not one of those 18-pounders, 24-pounders, or those 10-inch to 13-inch mortars that were fired at Yorktown. Right? Also, in case anybody's wondering, we are not about to fire a live cannonball under Route 17. Sometimes folks worry about that. We're not going to do that. We're all going to just take some rounds. True charge of gunpowder for one of these cannons should be 1.5 to 2 pounds to achieve a range of about 1,000 yards. What you're about to hear is 8 ounces. I want you to remember that before this goes up. Guard, attention! Search pace! Clear, load! Mike ready! Now's the time to cover up. Fire! Not bad for 8 ounces, huh? Folks, during the siege of Yorktown, when it really began, it lasted for about 9 straight days, and in those 9 days, the American Artillery Division and their French allies were averaging at least 1 artillery round from a weapon every minute for 24 hours straight, for 9 days.
24 hours.
When Cornwallis finally surrendered here on October 19th, 1781, he did not surrender by himself. He surrendered with roughly 1/3 of all British forces located in North America. That became such a massive blow to the British Empire here in this country that eventually even the King in England realized, fine, let him have it. So there's no point. Right? But folks, looks like we're going to get this weapon clear and secure. When we do, I'm going to go ahead and take this rope line down. If you'd like to come on over, take some pictures with the weapons, ask our crew some questions, ask me some questions. You may have noticed I like talking. So if not, thank you so much for braving this wet today, folks. Thank you.